a very special guest today from WorldNetDaily's front pages. It is Hanne Herland, and she has been a columnist with WorldNetDaily at least since 2017. She's an amazing, amazing woman, and I'm going to just introduce and give the floor over to her because I want Hanne to tell, well, we're going to talk about Europe, we're going to talk about Marxism, we're going to talk about Islam, and we're going to start with J.D. Vance. But first, you tell me more about your background. I know you came from Africa, your parents, you lived there until you were 19, and then you moved back to Norway. So just jump in and let us know.
Thank you. And very nice to be here. And thank you for having me. I come from a very international background. I was born and raised in Africa by Norwegian parents, and then moved back to Europe as a 19-year-old. And I had a shock even then. I mean, this is many years ago, because when I moved into the society, I saw that many of the opinions that people had were so different from the realities. This was pertaining to Africa and the situation in Africa at the time. I began to understand that Europe lives behind an iron curtain. Just like we used to say about the Soviets at the time, that we felt sorry for them. They lived behind an iron curtain of information. But actually, Europeans have been living behind an iron curtain of misinformation, and a socialist approach. And I would argue a totalitarian approach that does not allow free speech, but that allows those to speak that agree with the socialist narrative. And this has been ongoing for so many years. So when I first moved back and understood that, I entered into the public sphere, finishing my education, and worked for many years, writing for the largest newspapers, doing a lot of TV in Norway, and being a public debater, so to speak, from the conservative and Christian point of view.
And so you, though, have a website called the Herland Report. Now, Herland is Herland. And so tell us a little bit about your website.
The thing is, I've moved and lived many places in South America, in the Middle East for a number of years. So from that international kind of standpoint, I decided to create the Herland Report, and it's been an immense success. I collaborate with leading American philosophers and intellectuals, and have been able to create a sphere at the Herland Report where people can come in and have some independent analysis apart from the mainstream media rhetoric. So the Herland Report has been a great success, and everybody can go and be a member of our newsletter, for example, and get intellectual stuff, perspectives that are different from what normally comes out of socialist Europe. As for me, I write from the conservative angle and from the conservative point of view.
Well, we just had sort of a cataclysmic event in Europe recently. My very favorite vice president in the last 100 years or more, J.D. Vance, came to visit, and I think it was in Munich, and at the security conference, and he gave a little speech, and it didn't end up staying there. It went around the world, and I've been assuming that the impact in Europe has been pretty, well, it's been great, but also I've been wondering what the people of Europe, not just the leaders of Europe, have been thinking about what he had to say. Do they agree? Do they disagree? Are they happy and joyous and just dancing around, or are most Europeans in the mindset of leadership?
First and foremost, I'm a European, and I know very well the totalitarian route that he also experienced when he voiced the need for classical conservative values, the kind of Western values that formed the West and made our civilization into such a world success. He spoke about free speech, which is a problem in Europe. Like I said previously, we have free speech in Europe for those who agree with the socialist narrative. Those are the ones that have free speech. We have free speech for the communists that agree with the socialist narrative. So, but when it comes to the Christian element, or it comes to others, that we have seen for many years that the socialist system has steered us away from freedom. I was frankly shocked when I heard Van. I was not aware that he knew Europe that well. He spoke about how people in England and in the UK have gone to prison for mean posts. The situation in Germany, the situation all over Europe. And it's become an increasing problem that the regional socialist system in the EU has been going further and further into the totalitarian kind of shutdown of freedom of speech, freedom of religion as well. It's a big problem. And you're asking about what do the people in Europe say? Well, we have almost revolutions going on in France in the streets, in Germany in the streets, in the UK in the streets. There are millions protesting in Italy. There are millions protesting against the illegal immigration, which has been immense fluctuation of immigrants into Europe. I mean, we can take immigrants, but we need to take working immigrants for one. So many of those who have arrived go straight into the welfare system and burden down the economies in Europe, which probably is done on purpose. So when you look at the general population, you do see that Europeans are very angry, but the EU leaders do not listen to what the population wants or needs. For example, we have now we have the war in Ukraine, billions and billions and billions of taxpayer dollars go to the war in Ukraine, while, for example, in Norway, we have the worst road systems in Europe, schools and hospitals being pulled down because the government says we don't have money to funnel money and taxpayer money into helping the Norwegians. So this seems to be a trend across Europe that I think has made very many Europeans very angry. They are afraid. They are afraid to speak up. They are afraid of the government. They are afraid of the strong state. They are afraid to lose their jobs if they write something in a newspaper that their employer doesn't like, for example. And that's a horrible situation we have at the universities, for example. You lose funding if you say the slightest thing that goes against the socialist narrative. And remember, the socialist narrative is atheists. And that is a problem because, as you mentioned too, I mean, we do need values and we do need set of values and we need exactly what Vance spoke about. We need the fundamental Western values, the traditional historical Western values. We need these values to return into our blood system, so to speak, so that we can garner strength from the solidarity and the empathy that these values fostered in history.
Does the media, I mean, I'm talking all Europe, so that's a big place, but does the media express anything other than essentially the line that is put out by socialists and Marxists? Is it one voice in the UK, in Europe?
In the UK, it's a little bit better because they do have some voices that come from more of a different angle. But I would argue in Scandinavia, it's almost a complete totalitarian system. It's very hard to get across and to be respected as a conservative person. It's very strange because these fundamental values, the value of human life, for example, is a clear Christian idea that sprung. I mean, it goes back to the beginning of Christianity. The clear idea of the value of the human being, the thought or the idea of equality regardless of race and creed or gender, for example, is a Christian ideal. So those are just two of them. But why are the Europeans or the Marxist socialists so against the religious values, since we all know that these were the fundamental values that lay the foundation for equality, for rights, for human rights, in our societies back in the day, and this is what we need to have returned these days. But it's
Okay,
very hard to get this
that
message
it's
across.
very hard to do something once you've eviscerated your culture of its foundational raison d'etre. I mean, Judeo-Christianity is what gave us the value of human life, and in America, it gave us very much the structure of our government. The Book of Deuteronomy is what the founders quoted most in terms of, discussing political structure and political science or political views. So we know that that is the foundation. And obviously in Europe, Christianity is what undergirds, and Christian thought, Christian theology, Christian ways undergirds all of the values that are now considered Western values. You would not have Western society without the Bible. It just comes down to that. Now, if you're in rebellion to God and you reject God and you reject the faith in the one true God, then you're going to create a vacuum, a hole. And isn't that essentially what has happened in Europe? I mean, they don't even understand necessarily, like many Americans, that these values are Judeo-Christian or Christian values from the Bible. Isn't that really why? Because this is this is greatly a matter of ignorance on the part of maybe, say, the average Joe on the street. Like if you said, where does representative government come from? Or where does the rule of law, where instead of the rule of man, that's a good example. In the scriptures, it says in Deuteronomy 17 that the king has to write a copy of the law in a book. And he has to read therein and keep it with him all the days of his life. Why? It's very explicit. So that his heart's not lifted up above his brethren and that he turn not aside from the law. Well, that in essence is saying that no king, no oligarch, no aristocracy can be above the law. And that's really the foundation of the rule of law, is that all law applies to the entire population, including leadership. But if you asked most people in America, where does the rule of law, how is that established? Why do we have that? They'd say what, the Enlightenment, or I don't know, we made it up. So isn't that disconnect from that understanding part of the problem in Europe?
I think it's been done very much willfully in Europe, that you rewrite history to fit the atheist socialist agenda. And when you look back in history, what was Karl Marx? He was the founder of socialism and communism, and the whole teaching later became known as Marxism. He hated religion. He hated traditional values. He hated the capitalist system, strangely enough, because it was lifting millions out of poverty at the time. The guy never had a job.
Oh,
He
he's
lived
got a
on
bad
other
history.
people's. He lived on other people's money. So I don't know why such a person became it came to represent the total rebellion against traditional values, first and foremost in Europe. And fast forward to the 1960s, this whole student revolution that happened at that time was a Marxist, neo-Marxist revolution. That means socialist revolution. And even though it came out of Europe, it also happened in the United States. But I do think that in Europe, it caught fire in such a way that once you entered into the 70s and the early 80s, the leaders of the student revolutions in Europe now set their eye on creating a socialist Europe to the point that though all the traditional and historical values were to be eradicated. And you see it in the United States as well. Looking at Herbert Marcuse, Adorno, and even as far as the Cloward-Stevens strategy in the United States, which is quite recent, really, they go at it saying, we must crush the West. The goal is crush the West through communist revolution. And this is what they actually went on to do. For example, Marxist, this has not happened by accident. It's been a willful decision to try to crush the West. Marcuse, for example, he is considered to be the father of the student revolution. He wrote a book stating how one should, in the socialist system, suppress the voices that disagree with their radical views. So that is to say, since then, and we've seen it in a country like Norway, I've lived in that suppression for many years. It's a totalitarian media structure that does not allow dissent, the demonization by calling of names that you in the U.S. have gotten used to recently, but we have lived under that for decades. The way you're called a Nazi, you're called Islamophobe, you're called a misogynist, racist, all of these words. And I would like to add to this is the strategy of Marcuse to use those types of words. And when you read, for example, Vladimir Lenin, he openly states that we should lie in every way about our opponent. We should say things that are not true. We should demean them, defame them, belittle them, remove funding from them. He speaks openly about that. And when
Where
you
was he
read
writing that? I would like to
he,
read that.
yeah, I've written quite a lot about it, but I can send you some quotes later on it. So it's been a strategy actually to make sure it's been a strategy in the process to end the West as we know it in order to open up and reopen a new society. This has been the socialist ideal and idea. And into all of this builds the issue of victimization of the one part and demonization of the other part.
That's a strategy or tactic of Leninism, Marxism.
On how to reach the goal.
So the timeline of events or the evolution of events in Europe, the French Revolution, during that time, they tried to change the days of the week from God's system of 7 days, which was obviously very intentional, to 10 days. They did things to the churches and basilicas. I think they would even have meetings there, government meetings. I don't remember all the details, but they formed a radical atheistic society that was very deliberate and overt in the way they were trying to strip or successfully stripped France of so much of its historical faith. And, I don't know how that proceeded over the decades or centuries, but how did it happen in Europe? I know you just mentioned the student revolution in the 60s. And of course, we had World War II, which I have been told by more than one person, and I've done reading on it, that World War II undermined the confidence of Europe because here we, Europe, who consider ourselves to be civilized and many nations that have of the Western civilization that are civilized, that have these elevated and commendable values, that we did this. We did the Holocaust, and that produced a kind of question and maybe a moral relativism, because if we can do this, our society, then really is there any structure, any political system that is safe and is good? And then I guess start questioning everything that you have believed and arrive at, I don't know, various answers. I don't know if that plays in it. And also back before, since the French Revolution, I don't know how many states were of the socialist type in the 1880 or in the 1800s, the 1900s, and early 1900s, pre-World War II. So how did socialism evolve and atheism in Europe? Small question.
It's such a great question. It's such a great question because it's so important to understand history and what happened post-World War II. Okay, let's start with World War II in Germany. Many now have completely forgotten that the Nazi system was a national socialist system. Nazi is the abbreviation for National Socialist Workers' Party in Germany. When National Socialism lost the war, because socialism was very popular all across Europe in a number of forms at this time. It was popular in the UK. It was popular in Scandinavia. Since the early 1900s, there was really such a zeal to quench the church, for example, in Europe.
Pause for just a minute. Pause for just a minute. Let's go back to World War I. We don't have to spend a lot of time there, but it seems to me that with the Bolshevik Revolution or, revolutions in Russia, that I don't know if that ideology came, if Marxism was actually firmly entrenched, because he was the 1880s? Was Marx 1850s,
1848.
1848.
Yeah. Communist Manifesto, 1848.
So I'm not sure if England grasped a hold of that then, and it just started percolating and growing, like leavening the whole lump. And that when World War II came about, if that was another spark to the fire to increase its intensity and growth. But what happened in that era?
I think you're correct. That's what happened. And when World War II was done, it was clear to everyone, National Socialism had lost. The creation of the EU, and this is a fundamental to understand the EU.
But wait a minute, if National Socialism had lost, I'm going to interrupt sometimes just because I want to make sure that we don't skip over something when I think my viewers will have a question, or at least, okay, let's admit it, when I have a question. We go from the Communist Manifesto in 1848. There's socialism brewing there. We have the Bolsheviks that are coming around over in Russia. And then we have World War I. And these are, it's moving, or somehow socialism has been established to some degree in some European countries. But when Nazi Germany fails, it's a socialist dogma or ideology, Nazism. It's just National Socialist instead of globalist Marxism out of the Soviet Union, whatever. Why didn't they say, socialists? Maybe we shouldn't, maybe we should abandon our socialist ideology and move back to Judeo-Christian worldview and go with something that America's doing across the pond.
That's a good question. And at the time, socialism came in various forms. You had communism, you had fascism, you had Nazism, you had socialism, you had eventually democratic socialism. So there's been many varieties. But it's interesting to see that they did not stop their project. They changed the project and went into, and that's what I need to just say that, because please remember that the founding of the EU, initially as a trade union in the early 50s, that they funneled a regional socialism, while Germany had a national socialism. I've been writing a lot about this. The EU itself is founded on regional socialism, socialist principles. The idea was to unify Europe in a peace without God, that the European countries would be together in a trade union that would produce peace on earth in a socialist system, in a welfare state. And let me just quickly define socialism: a very strong government, very strong leaders, as we have seen in the USSR, for example, during communism, because communism is just almost the same as socialism. They're a little bit different, but they have much of the same inherent ideas of a strong state. Most people are employed in the state. It's very easy to control the people that are employed in the state. And you have a very strict leadership, strong leaders, often not democratically elected. And this we see in the EU too. The leaders of the EU are not democratically elected. A lack of free press is typical communist and socialist states. The free press is transformed into being the microphone for the socialist narrative of the current government, for example. You have very few free intellectuals because freedom of speech, freedom of thought, intellectual, critical thinking and thoughts, and that can bring important questions and also address abuse of power done by the leaders. That is not allowed in a socialist system. So just to add, this is maybe why you hear so little about what's really happening in Europe, because Europeans are, for the broad part, this is why I love Vance, because he is so correct. We are not allowed to speak. We are not given access to the leading media. For example, in countries such as Scandinavia, we
What do
are
you mean by that?
It's a very strange situation, but it's typical of socialist state.
But
Because
wait. I'm sorry. I'm not being rude. I'm actually just being engaged. Joking. When you say in Scandinavia, you don't have access to the leading media, we have the internet. Are you saying they're blocking news organizations from coming into Scandinavia, or how is that working?
No, I didn't. Excellent question, because that's not what I meant. I meant that, let's say, for example, a conservative person or somebody who is against illegal immigration wants to write an article in the newspaper or wants to pick up, and speak about these issues. He will face a total demonization for doing so. It's a system that is so totalitarian that, for example, university professors, you may say the University of Oslo, for example, if a professor at the University of Oslo, I'm very well acquainted with the situation there and the censorship there. If a professor there, for example, wrote an article in which he argued that we need to have a much stricter immigration policy in order to uphold the rule of law, and take care of the citizens in the nation rather than giving welfare out to everyone who's coming from different countries and are not even working in, for example, Norway, that guy would face losing funding. He would face the probability of losing his job. He would not be invited to the parties anymore. I mean, there's a style of censorship in socialist countries, such as Norway, that I think you in the U.S. are not really used to, because even though you have had Marxist critical race theory and a lot of problems lately, the past 10, 15 years, you still have a strong segment of conservatives, and you are allowed to speak much, much more freely. One of the reasons, or one of the ways that the European media is controlled as well, is that the state very often funds the newspapers. So if, for example, a newspaper speaks about the topic or raises questions about a topic that the government doesn't want addressed, they very quickly risk losing the funding from the government. So in a sense, you may say it's it's much worse than what you guys have experienced, but it can be compared to Google. The way Google censors conservative pages, for example,
Like
web pages.
WorldNetDaily.
Yes, for example. So the same type of censorship, although I would argue in the Scandinavian countries, it completely permeates society. So we are very happy to be able to have an American president now that actually is interested in voicing concern over the degree of censorship that we have been under here in Europe for decades. And you're asking, maybe you would like to have some more interesting voices that are coming out of Europe to speak to. It's very hard to find voices that speak up in Europe. If you're employed somewhere, you very easily lose your job. And the demeaning and all the slandering that will then go on in the leading newspapers on your name, for example, it's very hard for many people to tackle. So when the EU says that they represent the free world, which is a hallmark Joe Biden rhetoric, current leadership in the EU have not even understood that there's a new president. They keep repeating the slogans that Biden administration or advisors told them to say, which is why also they're so off course when it comes to, for example, wishing for more war in Ukraine. I mean, you don't know you don't know what to say when you see the backward way that the EU is led today. But this comes very much from the social groupthink, the socialist thinking that has permeated the EU since its very beginning.
Are you saying, okay, firstly, it is very difficult for an American to fully process it. Like somebody who lives in Norway or England, I think if I moved to England for a year, I would immediately probably be imprisoned, though it's so fast, or deported. But if I were in England for a year, I could feel the oppression firsthand. But it almost sounds like a fantasy fairy tale. When I think of some place like Norway or Germany or, just any country, Italy, in Europe, I just can't imagine that my people, like I look at it, it's like you're the West. You're in the West. Is it really that bad? Now we can see in America, it's very easy for us to understand what's happening in England because we happen to speak and read the language. So of course, in my feed, I get a lot of England, but I don't get a lot of Norway, unless of course somebody is writing in English from Norway. But it's not quite. It's not the same volume. So it is kind of hard to fully understand what it is like to live under that kind of regime. I guess just like how you would feel about looking at the Soviet Union before it fell, you could intellectually understand it and be outraged, but to really feel the depth of it and the strength of it, the power of that kind of oppression. So whenever I look at Europeans, I just think, what is wrong with you people? I have a heart of pity and love and a desire that they rescue themselves or return to God. I mean, there's a real love there, but at the same time, you can be disgusted. And I think, why are you such wimps and you're so fearful and tremulous? Why aren't you speaking out and overturning these governments? Why don't you get it? Stand up. And I think none act like none. And your column today at WorldNetDaily or this week at WorldNetDaily, new global era is defined by strong men with hard power. I really enjoyed that idea. But we need to be strong and we need to know we're at war against a deep state. How does that happen in Europe when it looks like all the men are little 7-year-old girls when they're bowing down to the state and they're bowing down to radical Islam? Is it even possible?
Yeah, we have just like Sir Alex Younger, former leader of the M16, I was addressing that in that article, stated in Europe we have cultivated a weak or soft power. Because the United States has paid for NATO, we have had our big brother that will take care of us whatever happens. This has been the general idea. And due to that, we have been able to cultivate what we call soft power, but it's not soft power. It's not soft power because there is actually no such thing as soft power. There is only hard power, but we have been able to cultivate the soft because the hard power, namely the United States, has been behind us. And the amount of incompetent women that have had official positions and been leaders in Europe the past 20 years that have been quoted in through the feminist system. This is soft power. Pick a woman, pick whoever else is considered to be the weak link, because this is central to socialism as well. That whole idea that power structures come in pair, one weak, one strong element. This is very important to understand in socialism. Socialism wants to lift up the so-called weak. Let's say a man is the strong, Promethean always the strong part in the power pair. The woman is always the weak. So therefore you will see, and we have seen in Europe, how we have cultivated the women. Women come forth, women come forth. So you will not pick the competent man. You will not have a meritocracy based on competence and pick whoever is best at the job. You will pick the woman. You will pick the immigrant. You will pick the dark-skinned. Sorry to put it that way, but this is you have to explain it that way. You will be very strict and harsh towards the white native European. You will treat him in a completely different manner and require personal accountability from him and responsibility at a whole other level than what you will do with an immigrant, because you will give the immigrant the victim card. You should feel sorry for him. He comes from Africa. You need to feel sorry for him. So I have spoken for so many years about the racism of socialism, because why do you say that we need to feel so sorry for an African or a dark-skinned person? It is because you actually think that people from Africa are not competent and cannot be rated the same way that you do with someone who's more light-skinned, to put it that way, or Caucasian, or whatever you want to say. I find that as a breach of the classical value we had in the West, namely that we are equal regardless of race and sex. So, but socialism has, I'm trying to explain, this is a principle that socialism has entrenched into Europe to the point that today you see native indigenous white Europeans so fearful of speaking up. But at the same time, you will find a lot of Muslims, a lot of people that just came here yesterday. You will find millions that live on welfare in Europe and don't even work. They speak up all the time. You're told you're racist if you even criticize somebody. And I saw a survey. This is just pertaining to Norway. They just did a